Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us from different parts of the world. Welcome to the Plastic Treaty Pulse, the road to global action against plastic pollution. My name is Clarissa Marambio, and I'm with Ambition Loop and an alumni of Columbia University's MPA in Environmental Science and Policy program. I'll be your moderator for today's discussions. So this webinar is co-hosted by the Plastic Network at Columbia Climate School and Ambition Loop. The Plastic Pollution Network, or PPPAS, for Plastic Pollution Analysis and Sustainable Solutions, was created in May 2022 by about 40 researchers, mainly from Columbia University. The mission of this network is to advance science and develop innovative tools and technologies that provide sustainable management of plastic waste for all humanity. And on the other hand, Ambition Loop is a global NGO that connects state and non-state actors to bridge the gap between ambition and coordinated action. One of its areas of work is the plastic loop, where we've been closely following the plastic treaty, working on different agendas. One of them is the intersection of plastics and climate through sustainable management of organic waste. And the other is the textile action agenda, an agenda that is aiming to mobilize action on microplastics and chemical pollution coming from the textile industry and its prevention of ecosystem disruptions. So our goal today is to explore where we stand in the plastic treaty negotiations, the science driving solutions, and the governance needed to move forward. We have an incredible lineup of speakers who will bring unique perspectives from international governance and legal aspects to scientific advancements and policy recommendations. And before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for reference afterwards. And please submit your questions in the Zoom Q&A box. We'll be addressing them during the dedicated Q&A session at the end, but feel free to type them in any time. And with that, let's get started. So I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Gordana Topic, International Relations Officer representing the European Union and its member states. Gordana has been deeply involved in the INC processes and will share insights into the creation of the plastic treaty, its origins, and how positions have evolved over time. Hello, Gordana. Thank you.
Hi, Clarissa. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. First of all, many thanks for the invite. It's always a pleasure to speak about this topic, which is very close to my heart. My name is Gordana Topic. I work for the European Commission, Directorate General for the Environment, and I'm a member of the EU negotiating team on this file. And I'll do my best to cover everything that you asked me to in the next 15 minutes. So the idea will be mainly to set the scene, as you said, and then to share some insights on the EU perspectives. Although I think it's important to note that I'm here in my personal capacity, so I will not be speaking as a representative of the Commission or as a representative of the EU. So what does it take to get the whole world around the table and to start to negotiate a treaty? So I think that's an interesting perspective to have in mind, because I think we all know the negotiation started in 2022. So it may seem as a relatively young or immature process, but in fact, there was an entire process that preceded it, a years-long process. And I will try to cover, the crux of it, for you to get a perspective of an idea of the time and effort needed to get this conversation going at the global level. So you all know that we are discussing the treaty under the auspices of the United Nations Environment Assembly, which is the UN highest authority on environmental issues. And the first meeting of UNEA took place in 2014, and UNEA continues to meet in principle every 2 years. And it's interesting to note that since the very first UNEA, we had the issue on the agenda. It was framed as a marine litter issue, and since UNEA 1, each UNEA had a marine resolution adopted. And there was nothing unusual about this resolution. I mean, they were very much a UN type of resolutions, very political, with a lot of encouraging language, nothing legally binding, but clearly recognizing that there is an issue, of marine litter, that there are negative effects to it for the environment, and countries being called upon to take action to deal with the problem. So, as you may see, we have started discussing this already 10 years ago. So this was kind of a standing resolution over the course of several UNEAs until 2017. And that was the third meeting of UNEA, where actually there was a first proposal to table a resolution to start the negotiations. And I think it was Norway who was behind it. Unfortunately, at the time, the proposal gained no traction for various reasons. Probably it was not socialized enough. The idea was not mature in people's minds. So everybody was still pretty skeptical. But there was a compromise outcome with this resolution at UNEA 3, and that was to set up an expert group to look at the issue more closely. I think that's a format that is quite common in a UN setting, where a body is established comprised of member states experts, and they are tasked with technical work. And in this case, it was to assess the issue of marine litter, barriers to dealing with it, and then to identify some of the solutions. And that group met several times over the course of 3 years. So until 2020, late 2020, there was a bit of a delay because of COVID. And it's actually in that setting that the idea of the plastic treaty was formed in a much more robust way. There was a whole narrative that was built around it, and there were now more countries, including also the EU, that were promoting this initiative. And the narrative was this is very much a transboundary problem. It's not only a problem of marine litter, but of plastic pollution, because plastic pollution occurs along the whole plastics life cycle. Yeah, oceans end up as a ultimate sink of plastic waste, but there are problems that are being created much earlier. And this transboundary nature is also inherently linked with the transboundary nature of plastics value chain, because you need oil to produce plastics, and this oil is extracted in one country. Polymerization process takes place maybe in another country. A product is designed in a different country, produced again in a different country, consumed again in a different country, the waste of which may end up being washed up on the shores of, again, different countries. And what we have seen over the course of time was that there has been action that has been taken by different countries. There were voluntary actions, commitment pledges by countries and businesses alike. But all this was too scattered, too fragmented, and with a lot of gaps left uncovered. So this is also one of the reasons why we argued that there needs to be a sort of a coordinated approach at a global level, that we need legally binding obligation. And this is the only way we would set up a decent framework that would enable us to deal with plastics in an efficient way. So that was the framing. It got picked up, and at the end of that meeting, we succeeded to have the plastic treaty identified as one of the possible solutions. So that was 2020. Unfortunately, it was also the time where when COVID started, and that meant 2 years of no international meetings, no opportunities to socialize this idea forward, to move the process and to start working towards a mandate, because to launch negotiations, you need a mandate, and mandate needs to be adopted by way of a resolution. And to have a resolution, you need countries that will propose it. And none of the countries will propose something if they're not certain that they will succeed to getting it adopted, because there's a lot of political reputation at stake. So in fact, these 2 years of break that we had due to COVID, we managed to put it to good use, because we managed to do all of the above, what I just said. So we managed to find countries that were willing to put forward the proposal. We managed to take some time to work on a draft mandate, to consult a broader group of countries, to really try to secure a broader buy-in, and really to come to the next UNEA prepared and quite confident that the mandate would be adopted. And that's actually what happened at UNEA 5.2, early 2022. It was in fact the first international meeting in person after the long COVID break. So there was a lot of positive momentum and atmosphere, and really craving for some good outcomes. And I think these were some of the factors that really contributed to us being here today discussing the plastics treaty. But the mandates discussions were not easy. What we did manage to secure in the mandate was to set up the negotiating committee and to task it to develop an international legally binding agreement, which would consist of legally binding but also of voluntary measures. So that was already a compromise. And then also to adopt a circular approach to plastics. And here we entered into a discussion. What does it mean exactly? If we were to cover the whole life cycle of plastics, where does this life cycle start? And there was a group of countries that wanted to be clear that it starts from production, whereas another group of countries wanted it to start from product design, so much later in the plastics life cycle, because they didn't want production to be regulated under the global treaty. We did manage to find a midway solution, and that was basically to have a language that is ambiguous enough, constructively ambiguous, as someone says, to allow for both interpretation, basically kicking the can down the road, and to allow us to conclude on the mandate with the task to develop this treaty with a deadline until the end of 2024. And which we, of course, well, not of course, but which we evidently didn't manage to do. But we had the mandate in place, and then the whole series of negotiation rounds started. We had 5 of them in total, and the progress was less than satisfactory due to a variety of reasons. And I think, looking at the agenda, I think it's Anders who will speak mainly about those dynamics. So I will not go into details now. But there were some opportunities to make the process progress in a faster pace. And we wanted, together with a group of other countries, to have more meetings, so-called technical intersessional meetings between the negotiation rounds, to be agreed upon, because we didn't have much opportunity in official negotiating sessions to go into some of the very technical details, because the negotiation sessions were so charged with political tension. And we only managed to agree on intersessional work at INC4. We did have this one technical meeting, and I think it was the most fruitful meeting that we've had actually in this process, that was really helpful in advancing some of the understandings on certain issues by different parties. When it comes to the EU perspective, we were one of the most vocal advocates for this treaty, for a treaty that takes a circular approach to plastics. And what this means is that solutions should not be focused on waste management only. Waste management is important, but it will not be enough, and especially in view of the predicted growth of plastic production and plastic waste generation. I don't have a number on top of my head, but I think it's something about tripling the waste plastic generation by 2060, if I'm not mistaken. And this means that the waste management system will be under a lot of pressure to absorb this additional influx of plastic waste. And they're not even able to deal with the existing influx today. I mean, in many parts of the world, you don't have waste management systems in place. And there's simply not enough public money in the world to be invested in waste management systems to be able to allow for growing capacity that they would need to tackle this influx of plastic waste. So the only way we see addressing this efficiently is to go further upstream the plastics life cycle, and to see how we can ease the pressure on waste management system by changing the way we produce and use plastics to begin with. And here, I think, the EU has been quite vocal about several issues. which we still continue to be important. And, starting from the beginning of the plastics life cycle, it's really necessary to manage the plastic production so that it reaches sustainable levels. We believe that plastics is essential to the modern way of living, to our, societies and our economies. But we think also that we need to focus on the plastics that really we need and that can make a positive contribution to the way we live. So this means also getting rid of plastic products which are most problematic from the environmental point of view, which we in essence do not need, which also means getting rid of most harmful chemicals in certain plastic products, which are dangerous for different reasons. For example, if they remain in plastic products, they are also dangerous in the context of environment. So if they end up in environment and they start to decompose, these chemicals will have a negative impact, but also then for humans during the phase when they use the plastic product. Another important measure for the EU is product design, and this is really about focusing on the plastics that we need, that we want to use, that we want to benefit from, and where some changes in design can produce significant benefits in terms of keeping the plastics longer in life. So making certain products that can be made, that can be designed in that way, where it makes sense for them to be designed in that way, to make them more reusable, refillable, and recyclable. So this is the crux of the upstream intervention that we really think it's important. But of course, together with the downstream part, there's also a whole range of, so to say, supporting provisions which are important for the whole architecture, for the whole setup to work. Here we speak about decision-making in future conference of the parties, where voting will be essential to secure in case consensus fails. Say that, for example, over the life of a treaty, we want to strengthen the treaty, we want to develop annexes, we want to continue adding products in annexes. If this is only to be done by consensus, meaning that only one country can block the entire thing, we will end up de facto having a non-functioning treaty, that treaty. And this is not something that we will be willing to agree to. There's also the issue of transparency. Today, we don't know how much of primary plastic polymers is being produced. We don't have that data. We don't have the data on, we don't know which chemicals are used in certain products, etc. Monitoring is an issue. We need to be able to monitor how much plastics there is, or plastic pollution there is in the environment, and that will help us over time to understand whether what we are doing is right, whether we need to change something in order to respond to the problem in the most efficient way. There is, of course, the issue of means of implementation, where there is certainly a big need for certain countries to be able to implement this agreement, and so on. So these are some of the most important components that we see in this treaty that will need to be agreed upon. Discussions, unfortunately, got complicated very early on, and this still has roots in what I just mentioned in initial mandate discussions. So whether production reduction is part of the treaty mandate. There is a group of countries, as you can imagine, predominantly oil-producing countries, but also some other countries which support them, and they call themselves the like-minded, who are fiercely resisting this provision. And they're also seeing countries, regions such as the EU as attacking directly their economic interests, and as regions and countries who want to ban all plastics, which is absolutely and fundamentally untrue. These are the countries who also, even if they see some benefit for some upstream provisions, such as product design, they only consider that voluntary action would be sufficient. So countries would themselves decide what to do and when to do and how to do it, which for us is not enough. Basically, it wouldn't add anything to the situation that we have today. You don't need a treaty to tell countries to do whatever they want or think it's necessary. So we really think and believe that there is a need for legal, globally binding obligations for the measures that I just listed, for this treaty to make sense and for this treaty to make an impact. Regards the evolution of positions, so I think it's interesting to note from the beginning of this process, and I'm talking about the negotiation process. So from 2022 to now, I think we've seen a really big uptake in understanding of certain technical issues, but mainly by the countries who negotiate in good faith, who are willing to have an outcome. So there is a positive change there, but it's still quite a bit of work ahead. Whereas when you look at the like-minded countries, I think, and Andres will give his assessment, and I'm really interested to hear that, we didn't see, I think, an inch of move in their position. And the overall geopolitical context, which is quite complex, is something that we need to maneuver in, which is not making the whole task any easier for us. But there is still this window of opportunity that is open. We still have this process. And when you look at it, I think we were extremely lucky to have had this UNEA mandate adopted, because today this would not have been possible. As I said, there were several factors that contributed to this adoption. UNEA was the first meeting. There was a lot of positivism, a lot of positivity and willingness to do something, to have an outcome after, this long period of basically dead international context. We are dealing with a problem which is quite visible, to which people can relate to, which people understand, and they want to deal with it. And it was at a time just shortly before the geopolitical context changed with the Russian invasion on Ukraine. And after that, things got really difficult. Unfortunately, it's unlikely they will change for the better anytime soon. But this is something that we need to work with. And I think I've exceeded my time by a bit, so I would stop here and I would head back over to you, Clarissa, but happy to take any questions in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gordana, so much for providing the overview of the plastic treaty and how it evolved from early UNEA resolutions focused on marine litter to the recognition that plastic pollution requires a legally binding global response. And as you highlighted, production, consumption, and waste occur across different countries, making international cooperation essential, but also that is and has been the main issue. How do we coordinate them all within the complex context with geopolitics, for example, and how do we align decision making and how do we monitor the work and implementation? I think those are answers that we're going to continue talking about in these conversations. But with that foundation in mind and science, you mentioned the chemical pollution and the chemical use in plastic production. So we are welcoming our next speaker, Dr. Basan Yan. He's a research professor at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and co-director of PPPATH. And he's also a professor at School of International and Public Affairs, where he teaches hydrology, and in the climate school, where he's dictating a new course called Plastic Pollution and Society. He'll be discussing the science behind plastic composition, his research on microplastics in bottled water, and potential solutions emerging from Columbia's research. Dr. Yan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. I would like to share some of the slides. Just a minute. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. Just a minute. See, I have a very busy screen.
Perfect.
Now it's good?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much, Clarissa. This is the great. So I'm so honored to be in the as a speakers. So yes, I'm doing my research in the mainly in three areas. And so first, I'm doing environmental source distribution and behavior. And then I was actually talking, like a study together with an expert from the Mailman School of Public Health and other institute to basically the characterizing exposure of nanoplastics and the microplastic and the linked exposure to the health. And then recently, I'm starting to doing some development on the how to use the advanced technology to remove the microfibers from the laundry, etc. So the problem is that the issues really is that we have a lot of productions since the 1950s. You can clearly see from this figure that since 1950s, this one exponential plastic production, as Gornard mentioned, it was dramatically increased. And even right now, this number is still like every, like 2 to 3% even each year. So the major problem is that among the primary productions, we we still there was 1/3 are still in usage. Only 10% was get recycled, and the majority of them being discarded into the environments. And these discarded environments, and they're undergoing various weathering process. For example, the UV light and the wave, etc. So they became smaller and smaller, and when they became microplastic, which is less than 5 millimeters, and then they can easily be transported. And also when they are can be continuing to degrading and to the like nanoplastics. So my research mainly focused on the, that try to find a proper techniques to measure nanoplastic, because 4 years ago, we really don't have any method to do that. So through the collaborations with Professor Weiming from Columbia Chemistry Department, we developed this sensitive Raman spectral method that allowing scientists for the first time to characterizing the concentration type of the microplastic and nanoplastic in bottled water. And this is a study which was published about 1 year ago. And we see that there was about 240,000 nano and microplastics, and 90% was actually nanoplastics in 1 liter bottle of water. And among these plastics, they are not only have the PET, which is the plastic bottle was made, but also contains many other, plastic, even higher plastic like polyamide, which is nylon, and also polystyrene, which is the one you used for the, styrofoam as a coffee cap. So this publication and leading to a lot of the media coverage. And then there was always questions, is that if this is the better in the tap water? So right now my team and my students are working hard to try to get the, especially New York City and also United States, what's the microplastic nanoplastic distribution in those water samples. So as I mentioned, we also collaborating, doing some of the real world, solutions based. So one thing is that we know that microfibers is the dominant, like 1/3 of in the ocean environments, and also in many in the New York City and also other urban estuaries. This number was much higher even. So the microfibers, how to remove them before they are getting into the environment. So one thing we are doing is developing these advanced filtration techniques that we can remove the microfibers, and then after getting into the sludge, we try to do recycle and upcycle using various technology that we are doing, and this has been made a lot of progress, and this is supported by the NOAA funding. So as a Gadana mentioned, this is the try to solve the problem is not just a downstream problem. You really need to think about how to reduce the production, how to put into the design and the productions. For example, there was a lot of the work that you find out there was a toxic materials in the plastics when they're putting in the design. Could we use like a public health expert, like a toxicologist, to be involved into the design of the productions? That mean be able to lower down the potential pollutions coming out from during the West deal with West. So this is a kind of things that when I was think about and I find out myself was not really, my research is only environmental science, and the others area like engineering and also policy and the regulations, public health. I'm not really expert on that. So that's why I formed this network. And right now we are actually trying to forming this cross-campus center for disrupting the linear plastic paradigm for sustainable futures. And this is ongoing effort. And we hope that we can doing more work to that to be really to address these global issues. And so as a scientist, I'm so anticipated because my students, Clarissa is in the both sides and also in a very, follow this negotiation very closely. So I kind of getting a lot of information from her. So, but I still feel I was still quite disappointed that the plastic treaty was not signed about 2 months ago in Busan. And as she mentioned, I'm also opening the course, and also I have quite a lot of student network, and my students and also myself and also scientists and the general public wants to understanding the reasons behind the lack of agreement and what can be done to achieve one, which is the reason for this webinar so that we can inform the like the general publics. And the one thing is actually scientists wants to offer the help. And so this is not only just by me, but also there was a whole team, which is called the Scientist Coalition for Effective Plastic Treaty. And in this coalitions was formed in 2022 and is a global network of more than 400 independent scientists and technical experts from more than 60 countries that are contributing to the treaty development process. And basically, we try to inform the decision maker and the public involved in negotiations. And this is ongoing, and I'm pretty sure that we will continue to do some work on that. And so one thing I want to emphasize is that like when we look into the negotiations and what is actually being included in the final kind of the draft. And this is this is the draft 1 day before the end of the negotiation in Busan in November 29 in 2024. And this draft clearly showing the Article 19, which is health. And you can clearly see there was almost nothing there. The part of reason is that even we get a lot of research on the environmental distributions. For example, we see that a lot in the alpines and also in the mountains in the alpines and also in the deep trenches in the oceans. And also we see almost everywhere on the Earth's surface. However, we are not really sure how, like how much was being exposed for the human beings, not at least to the detailed information that we can get. And part of the reason is because the health study was not really follow up and was still in a very early stages. For example, we recently we got this news that there was one study from the University of New Mexico, and they published the paper in the Natural Medicines and showing the high amount of the plastics in the brain, in human brains, and which is a great work. And so, but it's also we are lack of the information about how they get into there and what is the rule, what is the really impact on the health on that. So that's really one thing we should do in the future, and hopefully that we can get more support and do more research on that. So this is basically my talk, and so yeah, keep going, and I really appreciate the like the speakers that can come up today and then give this webinars that we very needed for general public. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor and Dr. Yan, for sharing your projects and scope of work. The scale of microplastic pollution is staggering, and it's clear that scientific research must play a leading role in shaping the policy responses. And also, the microfiber pollution on our water system is extremely high and is something we need to address as soon as possible. So thank you so much for the research that you're doing in the textile industry. And I'm hoping to see your filter that you've been working on in different places before all of the microfibers come into our oceans or land and soil. And they need to be filtered. So I posted in the chat 2 media releases of the work of Dr. Basen Yan for the audience to see. And next, we turn to the legal and policy side of the negotiations. So Andres del Castillo is a senior attorney at Ciel's Environmental Health Program and has been deeply involved in the legal aspects of the plastic treaty negotiations. Today, he'll provide an overview of where we stand after INC 5, the key challenges, and the role of different actors in shaping the treaty. Andres, over to you, and I'm going to share your screen also. Almost there. Okay.
Thank you, Clarissa. And I guess this is a timely webinar. Thanks for the invitation and also for let us to share the panel with the different panelists here from the different views. And I guess I will try to complement and not to overlap with what was said by Gordana or Professor Jan. And mainly give a critic view of where are we with the plastics treaty, right? And try to explain why we are where we are in this moment, right? So cartoons is a way to sometimes to vulgarize complexity in situations, right? Like where we are, and this cartoon shows what was the fight at the INC5 in Busan, right? Like if you look externally, it's just a meeting of 10 days with a bunch of governments and civil society, but it's more than that, and it's a question that include many fights internally, and I guess we can say that INC5 was not a failure. We can affirm that actually was one of the best INC meeting in terms of outcomes, and I will share and list the outcomes. Next slide, please. But first of all, I want to take a step back and show this graphic that represent the first semester of 2024 in terms of use of fossil fuel sources for power in at the EU. And we can say that as a positive news that wind turbines and solar panels last year overtake fossil fuel that was used to generate electricity. So, at the first semester of 2024, we saw that more than 30% of the energy came actually from wind and from photovoltaic energy sources, right? This is very important to mention because it's showing that this is possible, this transition away from the fossil economy to a different type of economy. But next slide, please. That comes with different consequences. And one of the reflections, and I am just mentioning an article that was, or quoting an article that was released by Bloomberg last year, that was trying to explain why why electric vehicles are not able in the US at least to drive down a US oil demand. And one of the main answers, or the main answer, is plastics. And the article is based off one of the most important forecasts of use of oil that is produced by the one of the agencies at the US. And the difference is the equation is as simple as this. Um, Electric vehicles in the US were able to decrease the use of oil demand by 600,000 barrels per day. However, plastic increased 700,000 barrels per day they use, right? So we're seeing a decrease in the use of oil for transportation, but we are seeing how the industry is diversifying and seeing as a plan B the petrochemical sector, right? And as Professor Jan was mentioning, we are in a moment of increasing around 3 or 4% per year the production of plastics, right? So this will triple by 2050, according to some studies, or according to the OECD by 2060. Next slide, please. Then having in mind that, I will just take two of the 9 categories that reflect one of the framework of planetary boundaries that is sometimes well known, and mention only some few words on the aspect of climate change and the novel entities too, right? And on climate change, I will just mention that we are out of the safe operating space, and that one study by the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory mentioned that if the trajectory of plastic production continue as it is right now, that plastic production will consume
up to 1/3 of the remaining carbon budget by 2050, right? This is enormous, and it's important to highlight that, right? And after I will mention what is the link with the actual text of the plastics treaty and greenhouse gas emissions. And then the second part is also how we are out, or we are at increasing risk on what is called novel entities or chemicals, mainly plastics. And there is a study, or the last study, because almost every year you have a new study that is disclosing how much plastic chemicals are used in plastics. And this one, or the last one from Plaschem, that is available online, is showing that there are more than 16,000 chemicals that are used in plastics, and that more than 4,000 are chemicals of concern in different degrees. And there is a few of those chemicals that are actually regulated under international or even national legislation. I will say that from those 16,000 chemicals, there is only 1,000 that are regulated. Next slide, please. Then Gordana was already mentioning the plastic treaty timeline before 2022 mainly, and was how we came or how countries and were able to came to agree to have a specific resolution with a mandate, right? So here you will see, the different meetings that happen, actually 2 or 3 per year. At the beginning was a meeting in Uruguay, then we had another meeting in Paris, a third one in Nairobi, then Canada, and then the last one in Korea, right? The red dots are simply a way to represent the text of the plastic treaty, right? So at Nairobi, that was the third meeting, we had for the first time a zero draft that the chair was able to put forward. Then this draft came after, again, in Canada, with of course the work that was done in Nairobi, and in Canada we ended with a text that was kind of a monster with more than 3,700 brackets. And that was kind of the document that was supposed to be the basis for the negotiations at the last INC in Korea, in Busan. But actually the chair came with an idea, the new chair, that is Luis Vallas, the ambassador of Ecuador before the United Kingdom, that was sharing at that intersessional meeting that happened in Bangkok, the idea of developing a non-paper that was called at the beginning, because he didn't have kind of the mandate, but little by little this non-paper became kind of the basis for starting having something more simple and with less brackets to use as basis for negotiation. And that was the case and the document that mainly was used as basis of a negotiation during the INC in Korea, where we were able to have another version that was released during the middle of the week, and then a final version that was released the last day of the negotiations, where countries were not able to discuss about that text, but that will be the basis for negotiation for the next INC that will happen probably in Geneva in July, according to the records of the last meeting of the Bureau, that is kind of the executive committee of the INC. But then there are other opportunities for us at this moment, or to leverage what is going on with the plastics treaty, and is the conference of the parties of the BRS conventions, Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention, that will happen in May in Geneva, the UN Ocean Conference, that will be a big event happening in June in Nice, then the UN General Assembly too, but that will be maybe after the INC 5.2, right? And then there is something also important to mention here, that is the need to have a conference of the plenipotentiaries, or diplomatic conference, and then for the adoption, and then usually what will happen after is you have the signature ceremony that usually can happen at the same time, but this is more deception, but it's probably something that that can happen if things go right at UNIA 7, for instance, that will take place in Nairobi this year in December, right? Nothing of this part is decided. It's a speculation, but those meetings are happening. Absolutely, will be spaces where the discussions will take place. Mainly, I think at the ministerial level or the more political level, right? Next slide, please. Then I always forget to present us at the beginning CIAL, and CIAL is an NGO working mainly in the US, or with a headquarters in the US in Washington, D.C., and with an office here in Geneva, Switzerland, where I am based, but we have colleagues from different parts of the world that works also remotely. And here in the picture, you see the CIAL delegation in Busan, and we are mainly a composition of different lawyers or attorneys, and also people experts in communication and in campaigning. And with that, what we try to do there is to support governments, support civil society organizations, and support other stakeholders in what is the granularity of what is a negotiation, right? Next slide, please. Then, for instance, already we heard it from Gordon and from Professor Jan that the existence of different coalitions, right? Like the like-minded coalition, the high ambition coalition, then the science coalition. And here, CIAL is one of the co-chairs or co-organizers of the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Coalition that at Busan count with more than 350 members that participate. You can see the enormous delegation that was in the bottom of the screen with the picture. And those are people from all around the world that represent even either their organizations or their own nation when it comes to indigenous peoples. And they have a different kind of background. Some of them are also experts on biology or on law or international relations, but is very rich as organization, as coalition. And I think that it's important to mention that that their participation or our participation is crucial, because we are kind of the moral compass of the negotiation there. And one of the problems that we face is the lack of access to the places where the meeting is taking place. Not the venue itself, but sometimes the room where the countries are negotiating. And this was something that we saw during the last round of negotiation, and is a pity that we are not able to provide support when the negotiations are taking place. Next slide, please. And however, the other side of the coin is that although you see that there is a generic group or a way to name observers, right? Apart from civil society organizations, you have, or the coalition, you have also a business coalition, but you have also a specific interest in keeping the status quo, or where we are right now. For instance, the fossil fuel and chemical lobbies that are dominating the plastic treaty talks, because they are going and flooding the talks with many lobbies there. More than 220 lobbyists from those industry were present at the last round of negotiation. And it's alarming because nothing is happening. There is not a single safeguard from for the process, either for UNEP or for the bureau or from the chair, to stop or to try to make sure that their influence is controlled in the right manner. Next slide, please. Here I will use a magnifying glass to go quickly to what we consider that is will be the basis for negotiation for the next INC 5.2. That is a text that contains so far 371 brackets, and this is even before being discussed by members, right? And we consider at CIAL that, and we coincide also with what was said by different ambitious countries, that the backbone or the red lines of the plastic treaty, the things that need to be included, yes or yes, are some specific articles that are, and keep an eye on this, Article 3, that is on plastic products and chemicals of concern, Article 6 on supply or sustainable production, as is called so far. Then Article 11, which is very important, on financial resources and mechanism, and Article 20, that is the conference of the parties and the competence that will be given to that conference of the parties. And specifically, on Article 20, is very important to mention that we need a conference of the party that is able to vote when consensus is not reached at some point. And this is not reflected so far in the text, although some members or many members suggest and support this idea of having the possibility to vote of insubstantial matters, right? The other part that I want to mention is to or to highlight is the definition of plastic pollution. That so far you have two specific options for that, and we think that the option 2 is kind of complete and is it mirror what the OECD is saying about what is plastic pollution, taking into consideration the full life cycle, that is all emissions and releases resulting from plastic production, use, waste management, and leakage from different sources and pathways. And on this, I will mention too that although there are many good aspects of the text right now, right, we're still seeing many detailed things that I don't think that will be necessary to reach that agreement at this point. However, there is something very important that this the need to include, and this is what is on Article 7, greenhouse gas emissions as part of the things that need to be tackled directly and intentionally by the plastic treaty. And this is something that before the name of the article was emissions and releases, and now the title is releases and leakage, right? There are two paths here. One of the paths is to use ISO definition of release that divide between emissions specifically for air ecosystems and releases or discharges that happen on water bodies or ecosystem and land ecosystem, or we need to change and to come back to the word emissions and to make sure that not only toxic emissions are covered under the plastics treaty, but also climate emissions are covered. Next slide, please. Here on Article 6, as is so far, and this is one of the articles that is more, I would say, controversial for some countries, but necessary if we want to control and tackle plastic pollution, is the idea or the opportunity to give the conference of the party the possibility to set a global target to reduce plastic production itself, right? And this comes with a specific need or goes with what Gordana was mentioning on the need of data and transparency to know how much plastic is produced per country, you know, and to have this specific data after to come with some specific ways to control the production of plastic through supply or demand measures. Next slide, please. Then one of the outcomes is not necessarily the formal outcomes of the meeting, but what happened there on the narrative. And you see a picture at the, you know, there with many of the representatives that are part of the High Ambition Coalition, and many others that are not part of the High Ambition Coalition, but they are friends of or other countries that sympathize with this idea of having some red flag specifically on the backbone of what will need to be included in the plastics treaty. And this is what happened in the meeting. I say that is similar to one of the performance that at the Grammy this time, that is what happened at INC 5.2, where the Hague and friends came for the first time very strong to say this is what we need and this is the plastic treaty that the world deserves, right? And this is the how we want to work. Either you are part or you are not part of this. And that was addressed to the spoilers and the blockers and to the ones that don't that so far have not been able to speak up, right? Next slide, please. Yeah, so here on the outcomes, we see on production that more than 100 countries supported text on production reduction, and key regions set it as a red line. Economic being always or was a key enabler, to mention that the economic case for reduction of plastic production. On chemicals, there's a problematic shift toward addressing a few chemicals through their use and few products. For instance, cadmium in toys, less clarity also. But then still support for addressing, but work to be done on galvanizing momentum, right? Then on finance, there is a remaining contentious part between donors and recipient countries. And Busan was experienced kind of a spillover of geopolitics or things that happened already in the previous meeting on CBD or the climate COP negotiations, right? Then on voting, as I mentioned before, there is the voting for the conference of the party, but also the voting for the plastic treaty itself. And so far, the countries are starting to see the importance of the voting, and INC hasn't resolved whether it can vote. Blockers still insist that on veto, which they call consensus-based decision, right? Then on the polymer fee or the plastic pollution production fee, there is started at the beginning as a no-go idea, but now it's moving into final discussions, and the fee is increasingly perceived as a way to bridge the gap. This fee is different from extended producer responsibility, and is a fee that will target a producer or petrochemical companies that produce and put primary plastic polymers into the market. Next slide, please. Thank you so much, and I hope there are not too many questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres, for that analysis. It's really encouraging to hear that the negotiations since INC 5 had good outcomes, even though a treaty wasn't signed. And it is important also, not only for the actual context, but to ask ourselves, why can Tesla drive US oil demand lower? And it's because of plastics. So the decrease of use of oil for transportation, for example, sometimes means diversifying the petrochemical to other sectors. So thank you also for mentioning that the evolving role of stakeholders and the representations of science, industry, influence, coalitions, observers, and legal groups and advocacy groups are crucial for the development of a strong agreement that ensures real impact. And before presenting the final speaker, and since we're running a little bit late, I wanted to ask the speakers if they could answer the questions that we have in the Q&A box, just because we're not going to be able to do many questions in the last 15 minutes. And with that, I want to introduce Alexandra Harrington, our last speaker. She's chair of the IUCN WCEL Task Force on Plastic Pollution and a lecturer in law at Lancaster University. She will explore the governance aspects of the treaty, including key recommendations, the role of biodiversity, insights from advising the African group, and what could help if there is no strong governance framework. Alexandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Clarissa, and it's lovely to be on a panel with friends old, such as Andres, and also friends new, talking about this. And thank you all for also coming on what is most likely for many of you a Friday or a very early Saturday morning. So thank you for being here. I will share my screen in a moment. Because as Clarissa mentioned, there were a number of points that I had wanted to get to. I made a slide presentation for some of them, but then also wanted to talk about a few of them first, just kind of independently. The slide presentation will address quickly some of the really critical points where we saw throughout the negotiation process. So in the immediate weeks, as Andres already mentioned beforehand, when we saw the release of what we call the chair's non-paper, which was somewhat confusingly for later events called the non-paper 3. And then as we saw throughout the conduct of the negotiations themselves, the release of different non-papers by the chair as an effort to reflect what was going on in the negotiations at the time. To explain a bit to all of you about what the evolution of the text could look like, or the way in which the focus areas and the areas of potential convergence in some areas and some topics had at least seemingly evolved to the point where the chair was willing to make some types of suggestions or at least grouping ideas. And then obviously we'll get to a bit of a discussion of what happens if we don't have an immediate strong, for example, governance structure coming into place at the end of the treaty negotiation process. What I did want to add, because this was Clarissa's specific ask, and so I'm really happy to do this, what I wanted to add at the beginning is just a moment or two perspective, because I am very lucky. So the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, as well as the IUCN and also Grid Arendal, which is based in Norway, has, as a group, received support from the government of Norway to work with a number of countries in West Africa, including some Portuguese-speaking countries, to help them throughout the process, to advise them throughout the process of negotiating this treaty. And so I've actually had the great good fortune not only to advise 5 different countries: Sierra Leone, Senegal, Sao Tome and Principe, Guinea-Bissau, and Cabo Verde, but also at the intercessional work in Bangkok, which took place between INC 4 in Ottawa and INC 5 in Busan, to be a nominated expert and designated expert from the government of Sao Tome and Principe, and being able to advise them on both the issues such as chemicals and product design and primary plastic polymers, and the potential inclusion in the treaty, as well as the issues of financial mechanisms, which we will get to momentarily. And also during INC 5, I actually was and continue to be privileged to be part of the Guinea-Bissau delegation and actually to be one of their members of the legal drafting group, which, should there be treaty text, as we had hoped there would be at INC 5, but now we hope there will be at INC 5.2, should there be at least proposed treaty text, then the legal drafting group is a special entity created at the end of INC 4 with the specific mandate of taking text that may be agreed to, or perhaps 2 options rather than 10 that might be agreed to by a meeting of the plenary. So typically this would be a contact group, a negotiating group on a specific topic, then sending that to the plenary, and the plenary then sending it to the legal drafting group, with the idea that we would then look at it as international law experts to determine whether there are any conflicts with established international law, and also to determine things like very mundane issues, such as the placement of a comma, whether we use a semicolon, and also whether or not the ways in which, for example, a reporting obligation under one article for, say, 5 years reporting reflects other terms in the treaty that might say 7 years reporting. So consistency, that type of element. As I mentioned, we didn't really have the chance to do a great deal in our last meeting in Busan because we didn't have text to clean, but we are certainly hoping that at 5.2 we do have more. And that has been a true privilege, and it has been a privilege to work with these countries and to help them answer questions that come up and help them through a treaty negotiating process, which, especially for the students who are listening to this, I think we can't say enough and emphasize enough that this is such a rare thing. It's such a rare opportunity. We know that many treaties have conferences of the parties. We know that they have either annual or, depending on what the time frame is in the treaty, meetings every 2 years, meetings every 3 years, etc. But to actually be involved in the negotiation of a new treaty itself is frustrating on many fronts for many of us, given the day, but also something that is really quite a privilege. And I think that's something that, as a closing speaker, I would like to kind of remind us all that really is something that we're talking about, a really new area. And it is something that we should always remember that we have that ability to do. And I'm sure many of you in the future will have similar opportunities in your career as well. Now, when we talk about what we are actually negotiating, I will now share my screen and just give you some perspectives. This is not an entire overview of all of the different comparisons. That would take a great deal more time. and be a very nuanced discussion. I will mention that by next week, IUCN and IUCN WCL will be releasing publicly a version of this discussion that is a bit more in depth as a brief, where we examine from an international law perspective the various iterations of non-papers and where there may be issues, where we may want to carry things forward, etc. So if you are interested in that, if you're connected with me on social media, I'm sure I will have many posts about it. If not, please do feel free to contact me or to contact me through Clarissa, and I'm more than happy to share that directly with you. But some things, when we think about what goes into a treaty, every element is important. Some things to highlight that we often don't discuss, and things that had differences within the non-papers themselves. So the various iterations of how we saw potential areas of agreement during a very short negotiating session. We start with the idea of the preamble. And the preamble obviously is not legally binding text, but it does create a great deal of framing and context and understanding. And as we've seen from the Paris Agreement, it can also be used to do things like substantiate future developments at future COPs. So for example, the idea of just transition being in the preamble in the Paris Agreement, then allowing that to be moved into the central discussions at many of the conferences of the parties, and ultimately to have various forms of committees, et cetera, governance structures created out of it. So this is something that when we look at the non-papers, we see multiple proposals for. There is no question that there will be a preamble. I think we all can agree on that, because it would be quite an odd treaty not to have one. But there are significant differences in terms of how the preamble is framed, what goes into it, what the levels of concern are that are addressed in the actual preamble itself, and also the textual connections between both the UNEA Resolution 514 text, which obviously is quite critical, since that is something we want to reference typically in terms of the authorization to have the treaty, as well as many other related treaty regimes. Objectives, I apologize for the small font, but at least there's color, which many of you know my creative skills are not that great, but there is at least color. When we look at the objectives of the treaty, again, there is a significant difference. And we have seen a number of iterations coming into the various non-papers regarding how long this should be, what should be in the objectives. Should it be something that is very much focused on having a very simple objective that perhaps is just the text of UNEA 514, or should it be something that is a bit longer? And also, how do we put these things together? So the differences, for example, between the 24th of November and the 1st of December options are perhaps very subtle, but they involve moving around brackets, which would then have an important place, important role in the place that we have different emphasis. So that is quite critical. Scope is something that is a bit confusing, and I highlighted, I know I need to cut this a bit short, Clarissa, but just to highlight, because there has been a bit of a confusion. The initial non-paper 3, so the JERS first non-paper, did not include scope. This is something that typically is included in many treaties, especially environmental treaties, although it does not have to be. However, there was a great deal of argument from a number of countries that indeed scope should be included. And so the 24th of November non-paper did include it. The final iteration, the 1st of December non-paper, did not. The understanding is that that was actually an unintentional omission. So we are waiting to see what the status of this might be moving forward. However, many countries are very much advocating for the inclusion of a scope as well. So we will see what happens with that. Similarly, there is a great deal of controversy with very, again, basic things such as principles. So whether we use principles, whether we call them principles and approaches, which is language that has come to us most recently from the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, the BB&J agreement, and what those articulated principles are, is very much in flux, and we have seen a number of different proposals coming out of the negotiations that are reflected in the 24th of November and 1st of December non-papers. A problem here to remember, however, is that many things that are articulated as approaches do not technically have an international law basis. And so that can be a bit problematic, not only in treaty text and its negotiation, but also in its implementation. So principles and approaches is something that will indeed be quite critical as we move into the next phase of negotiations. And of course, there is actually what we call an option 0 at this moment in the 1st of December text, which does include or does mean that there would not be any principles at all in the text. Some other areas to keep in mind, as I know we are limited for time, is a very important difference in definitions, as you can see by the dizzying numbers of words on your screen, that are not necessarily actually given definition per se in the various iterations of the non-papers, but are specifically included as things that would need definition and would need to be defined at some point, whether it is through an intersessional working period or through the work of the Conference of the Parties, etc., as part of the treaty. We also see a great deal of discussion, as Andres mentioned, about various forms of plastics themselves. Perhaps that's evident, but in terms of what we would do or what we would not do with regulating plastic products and chemicals of concern, this has shifted a great deal throughout the non-papers, as has plastic product design, which again Andres did reference. And the idea of supply and sustainable production has, again, shifted a great deal. The other thing to think about here is the idea of plastic waste and how very important from a legal perspective, although often mundane from many other perspectives, word choices such as shall or should, again, making it either binding or mandatory, have been offered in various contexts throughout the non-papers, which does indicate that we will have to do a great deal of negotiation on this as we move into INC 5.2. One other thing to highlight, and then I would like to stop and allow obviously time for questions, is that throughout the iterations of the non-paper, and indeed throughout the compilation document, which was the predecessor document to the non-papers, we have seen a very strong emerging dichotomy between the visions of a financial mechanism. And we have seen this is really something that is critical. And we know that no matter what iteration is used, financing will be very much a key to actually achieving whatever text is in the INC result and in the Global Plastics Treaty or whatever we might name it. At this moment, the key divide really does come down to, in a very simplistic nutshell, the difference between states such as those in the African group, the GRULAC, so Latin America and the Caribbean states, and many of the small island developing states who wish to have a dedicated financial mechanism for implementing the Global Plastics Treaty that is a freestanding entity, so very much like the Montreal Protocol financing system, for those of you who are familiar with that, and that would be directly overseen by the COPs and presumably aspects of the Global Plastics Treaty Secretariat. On the other side of the divide, we have many of the European states, we have many of the North American states, and other typically more funder-oriented groups and states who tend to view the idea of a financial mechanism as something that should be done through either the Global Environment Facility or the World Bank or something similar to that, where there is an existing structure, where there is an existing international organization to oversee and implement, and that where this structure already has policies, for example, transparency requirements, gender incorporation, indigenous community incorporation, et cetera, already built in, as well as a dedicated fund structure within each of those for the Plastics Treaty in and of themselves itself. So we will see what happens, but this is something that very much is up for debate. And especially for those of you who are students or are new to the topic, I think it's critical that we remember as important as it is to have a very robust treaty, which we all believe is quite really the point of doing this particular exercise, it also will be necessary to implement that treaty. And in order to do that, we will definitely need to focus on the financial mechanism component, how it is defined as a matter of law, and then how it goes into implementation in subsequent COPs, as well as whatever the structure that is provided might look like. So Clarissa, I will stop sharing my screen. And after 3 years or 4 years, I can finally figure out how to do that. And then we will go from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, for the deep dive into the governance challenges. The role of governance ensuring an effective treaty cannot be overstated, and it's clear that legal, regulatory, and financial mechanisms frameworks will be pivotal in driving global action on plastics. So now going to the Q&A, there's a couple of questions that I joined together, and there's one that I don't know who wants to answer it, maybe Andres or Gordana, but there are many reports that often fail to account for the origin of the plastics, instead attributing pollution to the last country of disposal. So this question is about one of the most continuous issues in the plastic treaty negotiations, and it's how will the plastic treaty approach the global waste trade and the unequal burden of plastic pollution? Maybe we can talk about EPR here as well. Gordana, do you want
go
to
first?
jump in?
I mean, I can start, and then also happy for other speakers to jump on board. I'm not sure if I understood the question well, but I think when we speak about the transboundary movement of plastic waste, I think this is something that is been dealt with up to a certain extent under the Basel Convention. And is this the question that, just to double check, is this the question that is being asked before I go further?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. And in the context of negotiations, I mean, it has been brought up several times, but I think there is a broad understanding of many parties involved that this should continue to be dealt with under the Basel framework, because we want, of course, avoid duplicating efforts, because it may just create more confusion. So plastics treaty in principle should not deal with this topic. Thank you.
Okay, great. And there's a lot of questions about the current US political environment and what advocacy do you suggest or, oops, sorry. Yeah, so we knew that the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, so they want to know how will be the role of the US moving forward, and how do you think they're going to shift their position, and how is that going to impact the plastic treaty? Maybe Alexandra can answer that, or Andres, whoever.
I wish I had a
Andres.
crystal ball to answer that. I think no matter what, it will be very important. Although what's actually really interesting is that during the last round of negotiations, we did very much see, and perhaps obviously this occurred after the US presidential election, but we did see the US kind of pulling back a bit and retreating a bit from being as active as they had been. And often weighing in to give a bit more of a historical voice when there was a point of rules or a point of debate, etc., rather than really getting into the process, which I think allowed many people to understand what it would look like, at least from a negotiation perspective, if the US were to be a bit more passive. And I think many of us do expect that there would be at least a passivity at this point from the current US administration. That does not mean that we would be without a treaty. And even if the US were to say they were leaving, as they have from many other organizations over the past weeks, but if they were to say they left or were intending to leave the plastics treaty negotiation, that would be difficult in the sense that you wouldn't have a producing and consuming actor that is really important at the table or involved. But at the same time, it would not necessarily be surprising, and I think there are ways that we could negotiate around that. It should also be remembered that even under the Biden administration, the understanding, at least tacitly, was that in order for this in the US context to be a treaty that could be binding upon the US, it would have to be something that was done as an executive agreement, and it could not get through the US Senate in all likelihood. So even beforehand, there was still a question as to how it would go into place. And we all knew that. And everyone else still kind of negotiated around it. So certainly there are many, many challenges with the current regime change. And it will obviously have an impact on the US position, but I think we could all at least take a little bit of heart from the understanding that this is not completely unforeseen. And there will be ways to move forward. Um, and we shall see what happens. We can all hope, and hope is the best thing we can have right now. So we can all hope, but one way or the other, everyone else will be there. So
Yeah, if I can jump in, I agree with what Alexander was saying and the assessment, and I just quote what the executive order for the withdrawal of the Paris Agreement said, and is mentioned. There is a kind of a generic paragraph specifically on international agreements that goes against American economy, right? And so that is very generic. And what we saw yesterday, for instance, at the negotiation of the tax treaty is a US that instead of going against, disengage, right? So here we can see two of the options is that the first is the US will disengage of the negotiation itself, or will engage, but in a very aggressive line together with the like-minded countries or the spoiler countries. That is the two things that we can see. But also we see that there is a lot of interest for a majority of countries to show that multilateralism still works, right? And to show that there is a way, and this is one of the very specific space to show that, right? And that can deliver. So there is an interest to show, yes, like there are things to improve, but we can deliver something here. So we will see that also in the discussions. And the third reflection is about some of the measures there. You see in the text of the final of the draft some mentions to the WTO and the rules on trade, and how that can't be something that disrupt markets, right? And we saw how the overuse of trade restrictive measures, unilaterally by the US has become a trigger, not only for the allies, but for the social, for the trade partners, but also for many governments that are now asking themselves, okay, what is next, and on trade law and trade regulation, right? So we know that will create exhaustion too and disruption of markets. Even the plastic industry inside was complaining about some of the measures of against Canada and Mexico there too. So you see that is not even on their own interest, and you have other economic measures, and here is very maybe naive to think that, but the idea of a production cap is also, there's an economic argument on that, even for the companies that produce plastics there, that they need to look forward on that, right? But those are my three takeaways. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres. And I think maybe you could answer this one as well. There's a couple of questions about the fossil fuel lobbyists allowed in these negotiations, including COP in the first place. They're asking, is there a way to limit or not allow them at all?
Yeah, there are different safeguards. First you start by knowing who is there. The disclosure is very important at the beginning. Then the second question is taking options like with precedents, for instance, the lobbies of the tobacco industry when it comes to regulating tobacco at the international level, right? This is another option that exists and is a precedent. I don't think that we are yet there, right? But we need some specific safeguards on conflict of interest that will look specifically on for instance, science, right? Like who will be the ones who will tell the governments on this interface between science and policy what needs to be regulated or not. And we know that science and chemistry is very sometimes kidnapped by the industry itself, and the different institutes. So, like the science, like for instance, Professor Jan was showing, that is the science that we need there in the room, not the one that comes directly from the ones that don't want a regulation. So those are the specific aspects that can be do right now, right? And we have seen also as an effect of the lobby, and this is to show the direct link. Okay, what it means to have 200 lobbies there. As soon as one country was very ambitious in the room, you have a direct mention to the high authorities in different countries. We saw that in Africa and Latin America, in Asia, telling ministers or presidents, hey, your delegate here is very ambitious and is trying to do this, and we had a lot of delegates that were under pressure because of that. So their presence in the room means also that, and for that you need safeguards, and so thank you.
Okay, we have 1 minute left, so I wanted to extend a huge thanks to all of our speakers, Gordana, Andres, Dr. Besan, and Dr. Alexandra Harrington. And thank you also to our co-hosts at Columbia Climate School and Ambition Loop for making this event possible. And if you have any further questions or would like to stay engaged, feel free to reach out to us. The recording will be available soon, and we encourage you to continue discussions beyond today's session. And thank you again. Have a great weekend and rest of the day.
Thank you, Clarissa. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
This is good.
Have a nice
Thank you.
weekend. Bye.
Thank you
Ciao.
all. Take
Thank you very
care.
much. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.